Ladies and gentlemen, we are back with another episode of Quote Unquote with KK. Last few months, we have been hosting global thought leaders on different aspects of factors of production, such as labor and employment issues emerging out of COVID crisis, capital markets and investments, technology and digital transformation, and obviously geopolitics issues with India and China. Let me set the context of today's discussion. We have had some heated political debate on the three farm bills that have been introduced and passed by our parliament. As a farmer who has been tilling my ancestral land, I have faced several challenges, not just on land issues, but ability to bring innovation, a freedom to sell my produce or what I produce from my land elsewhere. And interestingly, I spent good amount of time in 1998 when I was working with Britannia on the Prime Minister's Task Force for Food and Agri Management Policy and Reform. And there were very far-reaching recommendations that the task force made. And as a result of recommendations, several measures were put in. The first decade of this century saw agriculture productivity and production increase far more faster than the previous decades in India. We achieved self-sufficiency and food security. And as a result of what has happened, today our Corporation of India's go down stockpile. We do not know where to store our food grains and produce, and hence time that measures and what our Prime Minister said, Atma Nirbharta on food security could also be looked at. On today's discussion, I bring in Mark Kahn. Mark is founding partner of Omnivore Fund, which is an agritech fund out of the Godrej Group. Co-founder Jinesh and he had looked up a couple of transactions when I was part of Bangalore Angels seeding a few agri and agritech ventures. I believe a couple of them were already invested by Mark's fund. Mark has a very interesting background, worked with Godrej Agrovet before he started off fund, Syngenta, and a couple of other organizations. He has BA from UPenn and MBA from Harvard University. So welcome on Quote Unquote with KK, Mark, and it's a pleasure to have you on our show.
It is a great pleasure to be here, KK. Thanks for having me.
Mark, for our audience benefit, could you elaborate what do we call as an agri value chain or farm to fork? There are a lot of people talking a lot of things in the media these days, and some of them, I guess, we are on the fake news. For the audience benefit, can you just clarify what we call this whole farm to fork or the agri and food value chain?
Sure. I think it's very important for people to try to avoid generalizing the Indian agricultural ecosystem. Anytime you have a system that has 130 million participants, which together with their families represents about half the population of the country, generalization is going to come up as inadequate. But broadly speaking, about 15 to 17% of our GDP is just production, which means just the first step of growing. If you then take everything around that, all of the food processing, all of the logistics, all of the farm finance, insurance, all of the allied sector, you're really talking about something north of 25% of GDP, if not, which then reaches the realization that fundamentally the agricultural sector is very, very critical for India. That, it employs about half the country, and especially when you define it as agribusiness as opposed to just production agriculture, this is the backbone of not just the rural economy, but in many ways the economy itself, which was reflected very clearly this year when industry and services collapsed and agriculture managed growing and became something that the entire country relied on, or that GDP growth was still moving in some ways forward. It's also important to understand the regional and the crop pattern variation. India is, when people think about agri in India, oftentimes they think about, frankly, the guys who are protesting right now. They think about farmers, Sardarji farmers, Punjab, who are growing wheat, right, and rice and feeding the nation. And there's a reason for that. That is the legacy of the river. Those are the people that ensured that India became food secure. But that's always been only a small part of Indian agriculture. Punjab only has like 1 million farmers, and India has 130. So, when you move beyond that and look at the diversity that is Indian agri, right? You're really looking at, if we were to aggregate a crop, right? India is the world's largest cotton producer. That's something over the last 20 years. India is the world's largest producer of milk, and milk is in fact our most valuable. We have 80 million farmers in the dairy sector, managing 300 million head of cattle. The numbers send your heads. If you look at our sugars, right, we're the second largest sugar, the second largest of rice and wheat. Primarily grown all over the country, in the case of rice, and wheat disproportionately in the north. We are the second largest of fruit, second largest of vegetables, largest producer of pulses in the world, largest consumer of pulses as well, largest spices. So, it is a very, very, very interesting agricultural economy. And in particular, noting that the challenges that we face in agri today are more similar to the challenge faced by agriculture in the EU, America, Canada, Australia, then we probably want, right? There is still a very strong green revolution mindset in India, which is obsessed, which is what we needed, to be clear, in the 1960s and the 1970s and the 1980s, when at least, for a period in the 60s, we were heavily dependent on grain imports. And, it was touch and go for many decades there.
Correct.
But what
US aid and whatnot, we used to probably bring in the wheat from the US, part of the aid program as well.
Yeah, people called it a ship to mouth, and thankfully in the wake of Lal Bahadur Shastri launching the Green Revolution, right, India became over time food secure. But now, people need to understand that we are not lacking. We are in fact overproducing, which is the norm all over the world.
Right.
And so finding markets for what we're seeing is very, very critical. And look at our trade balance in agri. India is the world's largest sort of shrimp, right? So we've become superpower in shrimp, which most people, when they think about agriculture, again, they're thinking about North Indian rice and wheat. They're not thinking about some dude in Andhra with pond that is exporting his entire crop to Europe or more often the United States. We're the world's largest grower of basmati rice, and it's a major source of export revenue for us. We are one of the world's largest exporters of, which always shocks the appalls people. It's all butter, right? It's not cow, but we've become a heavy hitter in that globally. Most of that goes to Southeast Asia. So it's always insufficient to try to generalize. When we say farm to, right, what we're saying is the value chain of agriculture, going from the right, including seed, fertilizer, crop protection chemical, but also farm machinery, also animal feed, also genetic if you're in poultry or cattle. Then there is primary agriculture, essentially a farmer growing, whatever that might be. It could be capsicum in a greenhouse. It could be a pond that has pangasius. It could, of course, be rice and wheat in rotation in Madhya Pradesh, right? Then there's primary process, right? Usually there's some level of primary trade, which is where the whole mandi system comes in that we talk about. And then primary processing, distribution, sometimes exports, and all of that, and even retail, and all of that put together is this farm to fork ecosystem that Omnivore. So,
excellent. So, this farm bill, why getting so confused and heatedly politicized? It's just impacting one part of the farm to fork chain. And I guess there are only a few states who are protesting for it. What's your viewpoint? What are the issues and what are the challenges and opportunities that this farm bill actually offers to the country and to the farmers?
So I think let me start by saying that Omnivore is broadly of the farm bills. We think they're very good ideas. We think they've been discussed and debated for 20 years, and we think that had they been rolled out and communicated a bit better, some of this could have been. But if you really break down let's talk for a second about what these are, and then let's talk about why some people, because the opposition to the farm bill, in some cases it's cynical and in some cases it's quite simple. So the farm bills, they're basic, right? So the one that most is essentially opening up the mandi system, the APMC system, and allowing anyone that has a right to buy and sell agriculture And it helps to understand that the APMC is really a legacy of post-independence in India, right? There was this sense that banyas were just robbing farmland and a real concern. And it was an earnest effort to try to say, look, let's create regulated mandis. Let's create regulated environments where we can make sure that farmers are not being exploited by these, wicked vyapari type people, okay? And honestly, they, for a long time, I think probably did a good job. They created a very, very strong post-harvest marketing infrastructure that was highly rated. And we shouldn't, just because now we're ready to move past that doesn't mean we should look back on that as a giant mistake. I think like many things in post-independence India, there were really good time for them. The problem is when people create new laws, they don't sunset them very often. So that's piece, the idea that this monopoly should not be. And we've tackled in many ways over the last, say, decade, right? If you think about the entire rise of an Ola in India, it was to shatter the monopoly of, our traditional, Kalipili taxis and where you had to have a medallion, you had to, be registered, and creating competition in many ways worked very well, right? It is now much convenient to get a tax to be. It is much more standardized pricing. You don't have to argue about turning on the meter, right? In a lot of ways, this, quite similar, right? It's essentially saying, look, anyone would be allowed to do. Now, let's go to the second. The second thing is ECA. The Essential Commodities Act is, again, a piece of independence.
I guess that was the World War II thing during the British era when they wanted to ration out for their armed forces.
It's definitely a legacy, right? It's this perspective of hoarding and speculation, right? It's this fear that the local merchant has all the grain in down and is hoarding it to keep prices up. It's a very 1950s, 1960s, 1940s view of it. And so this legislation created. And the best way that I can describe, so the best way that I can describe the APMC is it's a monopoly, regulated. Best way that I describe the ECA is it's a very, very aggressive retro licensage piece of regulation. It really endows bureaucrats with the right to prosecute and harassment who are more or less doing normal stuff, right? Who are storing something, who are processing, who are exporting. But it basically allows for arbitrary fiat. And so because of that arbitrary fiat, and let me be very clear, I'm not a libertarian. I consider myself on the left. But this piece of legislation is something that in any other sector we would have ditched in 1990. But because it was agriculture,
when the license permit Raj.
Exactly. But this is license permit Raj for agri. So what this has done is it like the old license Raj, it has inhibited investment. It has inhibited modernization. Right? Why would you build a modern export terminal grain if you could see, a mid-level bureaucrat could come in and sanction you for basically doing your business of exporting, right? Exporting basmati rice or exporting whatever, right? Why create inland going to be held against you? And so this legislation essentially says, look, license Raj ended in India in 1991. We're bringing it to agriculture. And now anyone is allowed to store, process, without threat of arbitrary government takeover of pricing and stock of that, as long as prices don't cross certain levels, which are 50% grain and 100% for sub-horticulture. And even those circuit breakers, right? I mean, those circuit breakers reflect conservatism, right? They could have just gutted the ECA altogether and said only in the event of war and famine will we intervene. But they put these circuit breakers of 50, 100% in there. And then the third piece of legislation relates to contract. And that's the one that's probably the least impact and most risk. We don't actually have a contract in India, right? If you actually look at contract farming in India, there's like three major successes. There's like potatoes for chip in North India and Gujarat, right? PepsiCo, McCain, all of that, right? That's one where they needed specialty potatoes, the kind of stuff that if you tried to make, right, an aloo ki sabzi at home from, you would vomit. Terrible. They're not meant for that. They're being processed into value-added product. A second, right, is gherkin, right? North Karnataka exports a few $100 million of gherkin, and that's done under contract farming. And the third is that most of the broiler poultry grown in India is under a contract farming, whether it's a Saguna, Venkateshwara hatcheries, Zorabi, and Godrej, right? Most of the processed meats, fresh, and the brands in fresh poultry are all grown under contract. But that's it, right? That's basically it. There's not a contract farming story that's happened, and contract farming isn't the norm around the world, right? It's more of an exception. So this law essentially says, look, contract farming is good. What is holding it back, they theorize, is a lack of clarity. So they're going to create a standard set that apply to them, and which frankly are fair. Like you can't. They have tried to take a good balance in this contract farming legislation. But the immediate impact, right? The immediate impact of APM is huge, right? Anyone can do Thanda. Any Agritech startup buyers or any agri-corporate can buyers. The immediate impact of ECA is kind of immediate, right? Because what's going to happen is start saying, oh, I can invest now. I can start putting down that utility, that shovel ready. But it all relates to that issue of shovel ready, right? It takes time to capex. This will impact capex. We'll see this over the next 2 to 3 years. And then on contract farming, it's much stick and spec. Like, okay, cool. Now we have clear regulations. Maybe this will then encourage more contracts. Now, the question of why farmers and who really oppose why. I think it's important that we have a balance, right? It's important to not, right, to not malign millions of protests, right, that probably think they are the right thing and challenge, right? So, but it's important to also understand the socio-political, right? So if you go to Punjab, you go to Haryana, you go to Western, you have to understand, going back to the 90s, going back to that ship to mouth, a system was to ensure food security in India, to make India, and the people that delivered are the people protesting right now, are the Haryanvi, are the Punjabi farmers, right, who over the last 30 years primarily grow in the winter wheat and in the summer, in the Kharif, right, rice. So Rabi and Kharif.
Correct.
And farmers, right, have been in for decades. And in this, the FCI is the primary, so they procure 98, I think, or 97% of the rice and wheat in Punjab. Right, so if you're a Punjabi farmer, that's all you know, right? And that system, right, has essentially hooked, okay? Because the nice thing is you never have to think about, right? You grow rice, sell it to the wheat, sell it to the FCI, and when you sell it to the FCI, you get this thing called MSP, the minimum support, government regulated by the CACP, non-agricultural price, right? But these are like the only farmers in India that actually get MSP. Right? And the FCI doesn't, even though MSP has announced 30 commodities, it's only really purchased by the FCI for 6. And there's a bit of it around the Cauvery Delta for rice. And all of this grain gets bought by the FCI and stored in godowns. And as you said, right, the FCI doesn't have
now. We don't have a place to store.
It gets stored in lots. It gets stored open in fields. Right. It gets stored in schools, right? The FCI doesn't have nearly enough right now. Much of it, a good chunk of it rots, and we have actually more of it than we need. But if you have some, right, imagine you're a Punjabi, and this is what we're told agriculture is, and you've also been told that you're the heroes of the nation, Jai Kisan, right? And that you're doing the right thing. And all of a sudden, people are threatening that system. And in that system, by the way, right, you get an incredible amount of stuff, right? You get a fertilizer, you get a power, you have the best irrigation idea, right? Got all of the freebies that have been around decades that you take for granted, okay? Even though the average income per farmer in India is higher than the average income of most Indian farmers. The average Punjabi farmer gets 1.7 lakh of subsidy, right? Which is higher than average agriculture.
Correct. And income is about 72 or 75,000 rupees.
And the average Punjabi farmer is small, okay? They're not, but their average farm size is times the national. So these farmers they're first, right? They are relative cross, but they're also addicted. They are addicted to the system that they have been in, and it's not their fault. They were told this was what agri was, and meanwhile, all over the country, agriculture has kind of moved on, right? This system, this is, the analogy that I tried to explain is, it's a lot like Indian labor, okay? Most of the economy, right, is not even organized. And the organized sector, most of it is not unionized. But the unions are super militant because the people that were able to create them, that's what they know and that's what they want. And they're not wrong to say that, look, we fought for this. This is our system. So anything that approaches labor reform in India, massive freak out, right? And it's kind of very, very, there's nothing wrong with, right? It's not wrong that they're feeling threatened, but I think it's worth contextualizing that these are a privileged law, right? Even if they aren't rich, right? But they have lived in an existence where where their inputs are taken care of, their outputs are taken care of, and all they have to. But most of the farmers in India, that's not for 95% of the farmers in India, they actually have to think about what they make decisions based on trends in the market and demand, and then sell, right? So it's almost like the average Indian farmer is a micro, but the average Punjabi, Haryanvi farmer selling into the FCI is like a protector. And that's the challenge, is you've got a group of people that really feel like their protected workmanship, right, is under, right? So, and it's not their fault, right? That's nobody really wants to deal with this issue. And what's happening here is you've got farmers that are saying these laws are very, very threatening, even though the laws don't talk about getting rid of the FCI, even though the laws don't talk about getting rid of MSP. The very fact that the worldview of the laws proposing an agricultural sector with much private sectorization and much more entrepreneurship, that itself is being taken as a threat, right? So what they're saying is, you're not talking about the MSP right now, but obviously this step to abolishing this system that I count, okay? And the sad truth is, right, if you look at some of the things farmers are saying, one of their major demands is that nobody be prosecuted for burning stubble, right? If you actually listen, right, like that's the one. I think it's fun to watch my left-wing friend be like, "We are supporting the farmers," and I was like, "Reporting that they should be able to burn stubble without recourse," and they're like, "Well, yes, Jai Kisan, right? It's like they're turning Delhi into a gas chamber, and they want to do so without any. But again, even that goes back to the system that's created. We've created a system in North India where these farmers are incentivized to grow a kharif rice, which is crazy. Okay, like literally nobody should be doing that up there. It's destructive to life. We don't need the surplus rice that they're creating. If you're growing basmati, fine, great, massive export earnings. But non-basmati rice that goes into FCI and BS, we don't need it, okay? We can grow that in places that actually have water, like Odisha, right? Like other states. But because of this system, and it's because of that rice that we then, in order to harvest that rice, plant wheat. That's why we have stubble. So there's really fundamental structural stuff that needs to be done. And the reality is nobody touched because it's so politically sensitive, as we're seeing. The other thing that we all have to kind of, take into account is that there's some additional. So whoever rules Punjab gets Mandi fees, okay? And it's 5,000 year unaudited money. Okay, so whoever job, there is 85% fee and cess applied to that entire FCI, and that is it is loot. And so getting rid of this system, right, threatens that. You understand why any Punjabi politician, Haryana, it's 6.5, and it's got real hardcore political reason for some of this office. And I think the final thing that's worth kind of pointing out is, and by the way, I should say that some of the opposition challenge varies because it was under the Congress, under the UPA, that most of these laws were piloted at state level. Okay, they created a model Contract Farming Act. They created a model AP. It's just that in this situation, Modi is Modi, and Modi does Modi, and Modi basically acts, right? That's his thing. Whether it's what happened, with 370, where nobody thought anyone would finally take the move on that, and he did, whether it's demonetization, right? This is kind of the Modi playbook, is you don't consult a million people. You just do what you think is right. And so I think, he did that again in this case. I think he was fundamentally correct in doing so, but there was a lack of dialogue. These things kind of came out of nowhere. And so I think combined the fact that there wasn't much dialogue, combined with the political actors, right, react to this, combined with this sense from kind of protected farmers that this mortally threatened their entire existence, and the fact, historically, there's sort of an anti bias in Indian agriculture. Altogether, that's why we have the maelstrom that we have today.
I think one of the would have been also the cases where consultations could not happen, and I think the crisis itself turned out to be an opportunity for the government to bring in this regulation as well. So very interesting perspective on the farm bill, and really appreciate very simply putting it forward.
I'm going to add one. Sure. I think the other survey is that there is a sense that the winners of the last decade in India are that prosperity is not widely shared. And there's a sense that the winners of every sector coming down to a hand family ending with Ani, okay? whether it's Ambani or Adani or what have you, okay?
Right.
There is a sense that competition is diminishing, monopoly rising, and I think that if we allow the corporate sector to come in, it's just going to be the same, right? And someone said this very intelligently. They said, look, we were told that getting more competitor telecom sector, great, but now look, we have 3 telecom companies. One of them is on the, and Jio came in and lowered prices for everyone, destroyed the deal, and then jacked prices back up. And why, if the winners are going to be the winners are going to be just Ambani in this, why do we want that to be the future of the private sector in agriculture? I don't think there's a sense that, in fact, there are lots and lots, whether they are local companies, larger traders, SMEs, Agritech, etc., that are going to benefit. I think there's this sense, because in the last decade, so much of the prosperity has been directed to just a handful of families, and that's creating and that's exacerbating sense of unfairness.
I think well put, Mark, and that brings us to the second part of the agenda, the reform in agriculture for inclusive growth. So it's just not for the Ambanis and the Anis, but it's for farmers like me, and it's for investors like you who is willing to spread that capital wider entrepreneur base and bring in the next generation of Anis and Ambanis in this country in agriculture.
Adanis and Ambanis. I don't know. I just was joking that they all have the last name that ends in Ani. So,
but interestingly, it's true.
Look, I go back to that I said, right, which is really anywhere from 25% of the Indian economy is agri, and that should be I actually am that for India to emulate China, first of all, that day is past. Okay, that world trade integration is past, and frankly, it's not going to work. And actually, looking more to agri-centric development and agribusiness-centric development is very important. If we look at what Brazil has done to their agri, we look at what Turkey has done. That is a path that is less that we create more smaller town processing through agri-entrepreneurship, through storage. That is a good idea. And everyone at Omnivore firmly believes this, that if India can solve the bottleneck its agriculture, in particular water, we could be an agricultural power with respect to exports and value, because we literally grow everything. And if we can do that, that is a better path to prosperity than the destruction of our environment through heavy manufacturing, through mining, or, and trying to emulate China in a world where the Chinese model is now going to be challenged by the West. I think that shared prosperity needs to be there. And so much of what is on the table right now is, how do we disintermediate between farmers and consumers so that farmers can get paid more, consumers might even have to be able to pay less, and that the pie changes incentives so that farmers start growing for actual demand, so that farmers start prioritizing quality instead of quantity, so that our food becomes nutritious and healthy. There's so many aspects of this, but it's really about building an agriculture system. Like, whenever I talk about agriculturization, some people instinctively recoil. They're like, "Oh, you want it to be like America?" And I'm like, "Hell no! God, America's a disaster. America's more subsidy addicted than Punjab." Okay, the American essentially creates malnutrition and obesity simultaneously. I don't want that at all. What I want is millions of agri-entrepreneurs and millions of agri SMEs. What I want is India to actually be able to, the categories of explode. We should be exporting so much more, and we should be creating better and better agri products for our own consumers that address these issues of nutrition, that address these issues of health. There's so much to be done here. When I started working in Indian agriculture, initially when I was in 2005 doing some work for ITC, but then when I joined Gold 7, I always knew the decades of work, because so complicated and so interesting. Right. And I think there's so much done with it to make all of the participants' lives better. I think there's just a lot of resistance because the system has been the system for
Well put, Mark. I'd like to take a few minutes of your report and take some time talking about your vision, your 2020 vision, a very interesting report that you have put. And every 10 years, this McKinsey comes up with a FIDA report with envisioning with the industry body, but you have done a very different job over there. Would you like to enlighten the audience very briefly, maybe even your executive summary, a few minutes executive summary of your Vision 2030 on your report? And it's not you being very selfish for your fund here. I read it back to back 2 times, so I really appreciate.
Yeah, I would be happy
that when your team have put together.
Listen, the idea behind Vision 2030 was to essentially say, right now, in the midst of all that we're struggling, can we think past? Can we think past current crisis, COVID, everything that we grapple with in this moment, and try to look around and say, 1 decade, what is Indian agri? What are the positive changes? What are the negative changes? What are the opportunities? And let's be clear, some of the stuff that we talk about, it's not that we think in 10 years, every farm, it's that we think that is going to become, right? Whenever you think about change happens a little bit, it happens like a wedge, and that wedge gets bigger and bigger and bigger until finally the door is open and so many of the things talking about here are trends that we think initially progressive farmers will adopt, eventually top third of farmers will adopt, and hopefully at some point all of them. So we identified 8 major trends and 1 major. The 8 major trends, if I were to kind of summarize, one is this idea that precision agriculture and automation will increasingly create a farm of that. You will see a much more widespread adoption of these technologies on farms. That the automation technologies are critical because labor is leaving agriculture at a very quick rate, and that precision will become a new normal. A second trend is that we see a new wave of biotechnology coming, right? The old wave of biotech came in BT cotton, essentially just focused on productivity. It was just focused on, essentially how do we produce more of something by reducing biotic threats like insects. And I think our belief is that a new generation of technology, whether it's CRISPR or RNAi, gene editing, what have you, will start being able to create tastier, nutritious, eco-friendly crops. And one of the cool things about the new set of technologies is that they are more widely open source than a lot of what came before really came in from big ag companies that were easy to demonize and clear. Like if you look at Monsanto's behavior in the late 90s, it's
Right.
super demonize them. They behave very, very, in very crazy, unfortunate ways and built a negative reputation, even if a lot of their products were actually quite good. Suing farmers is never good for PR, good to begin with. But I think we're looking at a new wave of biotech that's going to be more focused on the holistic quality crop, as opposed to just how do we, right? I think that's going to be trend, and hopefully we'll see the biotechnology ecosystem in India more open to that, especially if the ownership of that IP is domestically held, more widely shared, and not just seemingly imposed on high by Western multinationals. Third trend that we're seeing, especially this year, is the rise of digitization, connecting farms and farmers and all market participants in agriculture. And that, when we wrote Omnivore 2030, we actually started it well before COVID. And that trend has rapidly rated by COVID, right? The fact that traditional input dealers and mandis and all the usual players in the supply chain was so badly impacted by lockdown has radically accelerated digitization, where farmers that knew of digital options but kind of sat on the side, being aware of them but not dependent on them, have now kind of adopted them very, very quickly because they needed to. A fourth trend where the APMs and the contract farming reform is a big part of it is the idea of that farmers are going increasingly become aware of what consumers want, and they're going to grow what consumers want rather than just pushing out whatever that's what they've grown for decades. If more and more want a variety of bajra that's very, very nutritious, but a bit more like wheat in terms of how it cooked, right? Because that's kind of want. It's an atta and maida addicted country, for better or worse. Then they'll grow that, right? And hopefully by bridging farm consumers, everyone can be made much, much better off. Fifth is that the majority of rural jobs are going to be of higher value and non-agricultural. So there's going to be a shift out of farming to other rural professions. And I think it's interesting that work from home, if that remains a viable option, would actually help to empty out of our cities where people can continue to live, maybe not in their native place, but maybe, in the district head, in the largest of the cities nearby, as opposed to just everyone saying 5, 6, 7.
Correct.
Right.
The rural BPOs are really grown over crisis. They have like
Absolutely.
1,000% growth in the number of seats in the rural BPOs because people migrated back.
No, absolutely. And rise of EdTech, right, is bringing higher quality education into rural India. We can argue about some of these EdTech startups and their policies, and there have been a lot in particular. But I think there is a power to EdTech. My own daughter goes to a very good school, but she still watches Khan Academy on the regular, or trigonometry or pre-calculus or whatever she's studying. She's up with that because it's just super high quality. And so I think children all over the world are benefiting from that. And so I think EdTech is going to definitely the education in significant ways. And hopefully we can see, like what I am dying is a world where people don't feel obligated to migrate for economic success. Or if it's, a more localized world is actually kind of better and more stable. So definitely, yes, if you're an aspiring artist, right, you're probably going to move back. Like, that's how it is. But if you want a success corporate career and you're from, coastal Andhra, you should be able to have that career, going to be able to have that career in Vijayawada without feeling the obligation to migrate. So I'm hoping that we're going to start seeing this, and obviously even smaller towns becoming more successful. A sixth point we have done is that we're going to start seeing much more fresh green that are available. So right now, a lot of those fresh are grown in open fields, kind of pesticide soaked. But
on the things and what,
right,
especially around Bombay and other places.
Yeah, exactly. Start more and more organized, peri-urban, controlled environment. When I say, I don't mean urban farming, I don't mean vertical U.S. style LED greenhouses. I mean essentially polyhouse encircling our cities, where you're going to have fresher stuff that becomes available that is higher and higher quality, that was grown in greenhouses, polyhouse, net house, very little pesticide, that's safe and healthy and very, very fresh. And I think we're going to start seeing a better system for that all over. A seventh point is that diversity, quality, and sustainability of all food sources will increase. And finally, that food will increasingly and scientifically replace medicine, that there'll be a symbiotic relationship between food and medicine. And honestly, like, India has been doing that millennia. If you think of Ayurveda and things, we've always known of the medicinal powers. But as our understanding genetic and human nutrition increases, we can increasingly change our diets to reflect. We can have this synth between Ayurveda and modern understanding of DNA and the microbiome and all of these things, and put it all together and start eating in ways that take care of some of our risks, like diabetes and other kind of congenital diseases or chronic. And so all of that together, we would say we're pretty optimistic about what the future of Indian agriculture looks like, with one major caveat, and that is climate change is going to whipsaw Indian agriculture.
I was going to ask you about that.
Yeah.
We're seeing, because of lack of traffic and lack of vehicular pollution, we had enough and ample rain, which destroyed the crops also at some places. How do we look at this major threat looming very large over the world?
Look, I think it's one of these things. We all have to come together on a war footing and figure out what needs to be done to address this. And it's a challenge. If you think about the last 12 months, it's been a challenge to get people to stand 6 feet away from each other and wear masks, which is, let's be honest, not that hard, okay? It's gonna be hard. This is gonna be like a mass struggle where public, private, not-for-profit, civic world has to come together and figure out how to both mitigation, how do we reduce our emissions, and, right, adaptation drives, how do we make our agri. And this is going to be, it's daunting to even think about it. And I think right now, whether it's all nations are sort of taking it seriously and sort of seeing what they can get away with. And we're going to get, I'm not special that we're going to be able to engage very well, because I think everyone's encouraged to free ride. We're going to have to do adaptation-wise. Our agricultural sector is going to see, between highly variable climate, rising average temperature, more biotic threats of diseases and insects, just across the board, we're going to be stressed and challenged. And that is going to be very, very, but it's also going to create very unique opportunities for Indian companies, for startups, for Indian farmers. And it's just a matter of how we come together and do this, and hope we can.
So, Mark, I would love to wrap up this session with two more points that I want to get your thoughts on. The first is what China did to the world and Africa and Australia for mineral and other resources, do you think India would leverage Africa as the next destination for agriculture? We have seen a couple of our Indian entrepreneurs actually in Africa doing floriculture, doing shrimp farming, doing feeds, animal feed, but that's not on the grandiose scale that you mentioned about, that India could become a very big food powerhouse of the world.
India
What's your
doesn't.
view?
My view is let African lead in Africa, and let Indians succeed in India. Not trying to be Trumpy about it, right? Just in the sense that I think most of these experiments in Africa have largely failed. There was a point where an Indian entrepreneur owned lakhs of acres in Ethiopia, and eventually it was taken away from him.
Yeah,
Almost
by the
none.
dictator.
Almost none of the land-based, large-scale farming projects in Africa have really taken off. I definitely think Africa is a good opportunity for Indian entrepreneurs from a processing perspective, for Indian agribusiness owners. And I would never say no, don't do that. But what I would say is, if the plan is let's aggregate huge land tracts that used to be owned by small farmers and farm them, I would say is probably not going to be sustainable. And honestly, if you look at the Chinese in Africa, they've engendered massive amounts of resentment. There is serious pushback to their sort of economic extortionism. I'll put it this way. I tend to take a pretty hardcore pro-India, anti-China stance on those things. So I really think that India needs to understand the Chinese threat for what it is and meet it. And that also means behaving in better ways with our global partners. If China's approach to Africa is essentially to strip mine, then if Indian entrepreneurs can come in and be better and leverage the Indian diaspora, which, to be clear, dominates trade in places like Kenya and Uganda and Tanzania, Sindhis in Nigeria, and do so in ways that create shared value, then I think it will benefit India tremendously that we know how to do business without depriving locals of their own sovereignty, basically. So what I would say is let's avoid the whole. There's so much to be done in Indian agriculture in India that this whole fantasy of doing kind of land colonialism, it's a terrible idea, honestly.
Well put. I accept your point, Mark. Last question, because I've got ancestral land and we are doing work on it. My biggest challenge is the land reforms. And I've had issues with land mafia. I've had issues at the legal courts and whatnot. Do you think, how do we solve this issue of land fragmentation and land mafia, all trying to gobble up the agricultural land? What is the kind of reform do you think we need to do for the betterment of agriculture?
I really wish there had been a fourth farm bill for land, right? I honestly think that is a massive missed opportunity. And I think, my hope was when people asked me about the farm bills in June, July, August, as it was just rolling out, I was like, oh, okay, they're going to do land next. And now I'm like, I don't know. This was pushback was pretty big. You really have a serious challenge in land. You have a challenge that if you are a landowner, you barely have there are very few ways that you can legally, safely lease your land if you don't want to cultivate it, right?
Correct.
And you always will have the fear that whoever you lease it to could expropriate it from you. On the other hand, we have a terrible challenge, which is that all of our subsidies and benefits are all land-based in agriculture. So even if a farmer owns 1 hectare, but is tilling 5 hectares, he only can get benefit for the hectare that he owns, right? And the rest of the benefits would go to someone else. You just don't have a free market in land. You can't buy and sell. There have been some reforms. The state of Karnataka recently reformed agricultural land purchases to allow anyone to kind of do it. And as a result, because there's so much control, you have a land mafia. And because there's so much control, you have patparis across the country, basically, what's the better word? Looting. Looting is okay. Right. And that system is not a new system. It dates back to the Mughal. But I think a couple things need to happen. One is we need to have an absolutely we need to have a massive kind of Operation Flood style project with respect to land digitization, right? Where the records are digitized, entirely transparent, and where we finalize, about 15% of the agricultural land in India is under dispute. And those disputes go on for decades.
I'm suffering one on mine.
Right. So if we can do a major push on digitization, finally build a complete digital record, have a complete record of ship, that will unlock, and then finally, when we do that, build a record that reflects not just who owns the land, but who is cultivating it. And if we can have a digital contract that for leasing, right? And people have talked about the applications of blockchain here, where if you lease, if Farmer Ram leases to Farmer Shyam, okay, then Farmer Shyam, it is reflected in the database, but there's no chance that he can expropriate that. But then all subsidies and benefits go to the cultivator. Then we have a free market in land. We have benefits, especially in this world of DBT going to the right. It will be a much better system. But it's one of those things. The same way that challenging the Mandi, right, is and challenging that monopoly and all the people that benefit from that awful monopoly. It's the same thing as there in land. So many people benefit. So many mid-level bureaucrats benefit from this power, from this opaqueness, this opacity. It's going to be hard, but I think it's very, very critical, because what we need to allow people that want to farm more. And for people that don't want to farm, it shouldn't be that some, the least intelligent child is kept on farm because, God forbid, you lease and someone steals. And I don't think in general that we're going to move towards more consolidated farms in terms of ownership. I think India is so dense and so rapidly urbanizing that any farmer knows that the optionality on their land value is very, very high. They know that Haryanvi farmers that sold for 1 lakh per acre to DLF 90 are suicidal, okay? Like, correct. Look at what their land value could have been. So I think people want to hold their land. They don't want it, but they need to be able to freely lease. And we also need to allow larger and larger farm manager, right, that don't own what they are cultivating, but proper farm manager. Like you see, you don't really even have this in the US as much, but in Latin America, it's very, very common, right, to see a farm manager managing 1 lakh hectares, but those lakh hectares are 30 hectares, 50 hectares, 30, 50, 30, 50 from tons and tons of people that they put together and manage. And I hope that we can move in that direction. I just think in general, after all of this pushback on these 3 farm bills, it might be another 5 or 10 years before we see more agri reform.
Well, Mark, it's been great chatting with you. Before I go, I want to probably know one last thing. How's your second fund doing? And I'm sure you're looking to exciting investment opportunities.
Look, its second fund is doing great. I think in general, we're seeing more entrepreneurs in this agri-tech space. We're seeing better entrepreneurs. That's not to denigrate my first fund entrepreneurs. It's just that the kinds of people that are coming into this space now are increasingly prior startup veterans, non-agri startup veterans that know growth hacking and blitz scaling and know how to build a startup and are now tackling our sector. So we're pretty excited by everything we're seeing, and we're seeing much faster levels of growth than we saw in our first fund. The digitization environment, the ubiquity of smartphone, 4G, what Geo has rolled out to their full credit. I know I was knocking the emperor a little bit earlier, but what they have been able to build in the mobile sector has really rapidly digitized rural India. And so I think the enabling environment for startups is much easier today than it was 4 years ago, 6 years ago, 8 years ago, 10 years ago. And so the businesses that we're investing in now are growing much faster than we invested in earlier, and we're very, very bullish on the space.
Excellent. On this note, Mark, I need to wrap up. I really appreciate you spending time and talking to us on this topic, which is also fairly near and dear to me, although I'm more on the healthcare side of things, but nutrition and wellness is very important to me. So thank you very much, Mark, for taking this time and talking to us. Before we part, I'd like to thank our sponsors, our team members for having done the due work. I'd like to make one last announcement. We will close 2020, the year, with Mark Mobius, who's going to come in next week to give us the 2021 perspective. Thank you very much and stay safe. Bye-bye, Mark.
Take care. Bye-bye.